Hello everyone, today we talk about Kyivan Rusian warfare during the 12th century. We have introduced Rusian warfare from the previous episodes of the series. I made videos about the general warfare of the region throughout the medieval centuries, so we'll come back on that. Specifically, we discussed today instead the golden age of the Rus, the incredible melange, but also successful, functionality of the Kievan man-at-arm panoply, and more. Also the Cumans, these Turkic populations that were to enter the southeastern sphere of influence of the Rus, to the point of participating to their politics, to their military, and more. Right, the 12th century is really the apotheosis, the one that fundamentally follows the heroic, say, barbarian period of Russian history, terminating practically by the end of the 10th century, and that witnesses very important evolution, right? As we'll see from this kind of more mercenary, almost tribal dimension that the Varangian polities had first molded to a settled one, and also a very balanced one institutionally speaking. As we'll see, we can't speak properly of a feudal world, right? There is a strong, say, a middle class in the great Russian cities that builds up together with the princes a very balanced system, at least up to the 12th century. It's very functional. This goes in parallel, as you know, with Christianization, with the reception of an impressive amount of Byzantine influence from Constantinople, that, however, is, let's say, probably overrated as far as the local Slavic development was concerned. Right, this is a bit true for the Norse phase too. That is to say, it's not just like a blend between external military cultures. By that point, the Slavs have been compacting to a degree that had allowed, in the first place, first of all, the Rurikid intervention and rooting in a dynastic form, and still, of course, with the decisive support of the Slavic elites that were already capable, in fact, of mobilizing under significantly concentrated control a large amount of men and material, right, and essentially consolidating further a more updated and also, professional system as far as the core of their army was concerned. Naturally, this is true for any system, say, that evolves in a settled direction. It goes by layers. Of course, there is an elite that de facto fights all life long. Then there are other elements, but this is very well structured and reaching its apex, its peak by the 12th century, especially the first part. That's the we'll see it, by the way, because I started also a mini-series about the Kievan Rus, and we will see it step by step from a political and social point of view. Today we just profile a bit this from the military one instead. There was naturally a great tribal ethos still leaving many parts of the Rus, that again occupied an enormous area, the fringes of which we have seen in the previous episode being still very, very primitive, right? Very tribal at some point, also very backwards, but still contributing to as tributaries to the forces of the Rus, against whom they couldn't really oppose themselves more than much, if not, in fact, leaving at the outskirts. All of it being supported by external powers like the Moldovians with the Volga Bulgars, etc. But the Cumans were the strongest, right? The echo of the far-reaching campaigns of Igor's son Sviatoslav were always there in the memory. This guy basically took on anyone, right? He fought with the Byzantines, with the Bulgarians, the Balkan ones, the Volga ones. He fought against Khazaria and further, like basically anybody who came in the range, right, of this ruler was hit, and with practically almost always a consistent success. The Trans-Eurasian trade route, as a consequence, especially after the destruction of the Khazar Khaganate that had basically crumbled under the hammer of the Rus, shifted, in fact, from the Volga to the Dnieper River, meaningfully enough. This, in perspective, is also normal in as much as the Slavs as a sedentary population by this point, and that, as we've seen, had expanded in Eastern Europe, also under what was essentially a functional Khazar state, had the advantage of, again, a more, at least territorially based power, right? That it was unavoidably better, located closer to civilization compared to the Khazars. Again, not depending on a large amount of nomadic or semi-nomadic subjects that, as you know, are very unstable to tame. They still would control part of them, right, by becoming the new overlords. But, of course, their center of power was radically shifted west compared to the Khazars. And as a consequence, on the major Russian rivers, with a really great amount of surplus available. We are in the 12th century, so Scandinavia has been Christianized. The Byzantine Empire has been re-expanding dramatically. So Central Europe has been consolidating as well. So there is all a European world, especially in the 12th century, taking off dramatically, and the Rus find themselves exactly over controlling these major riverways, with a lot of also kind of raw items, goods, let's say, that could be traded for timber, slaves still, because the presence of the frontier, the fact that there were lots of other pagan people further east, etc., allowed, of course, that this population was also, Christianly speaking, developing a bit on their own, albeit under the Greek Church could easily just keep seizing large amounts of populations, trading them elsewhere, also with Islamic powers, by the way, which doesn't have to be underestimated. So in a way, they continued what had been started by the Vikings back in the day, and being substantially more powerful. I mean, if you look at Scandinavia, admittedly, yes, they were different in as much as they were essentially Frankish, right, by that point in culture, Roman, Catholic, etc. But it took a long time before even relatively small kingdoms like the one of Sweden would consolidate as like single states, right? The Rus was at least much bigger, right? It never achieved a direct control over the entirety of these principalities that were basically almost all autonomous from one another. Kiev, however, staying in the very center of this, was recognized as it would happen. I made a video about the similarities with PS Poland, right? So these principalities that competed with one another, but that recognized the seniorate fundamentally to a single one, and that shared common blood ties. In this case, the alleged, or it may have been a thing for real, descendants from the Rurikids, right? And essentially, as dynasts, strengthening their own position, intermarrying and so on, and countering together and being countered by the aforementioned mercantile estates that were quite powerful, because again, Eastern Europe was still populated by an important amount of first of all, an important amount of population, in spite of it was all scattered again on this enormous territory, was consistent and difficult in the sense to simply go there and simply take over, right? And the surplus was big, but mainly in the cities. So the princely power had to be negotiated in that place as well, because there were powerful merchants in the same city and lots of peasants outside that were living in a bit more of a rustic way, and they would keep doing so, but that were people you didn't want to mess up excessively with, and that you would want instead to co-opt, to channel, to properly to direct in the major expansion directions, right, of the Rus. That had, however, still lots of challenges, and that's the reason why we talk about this in a series dedicated to the steppes, because that's where, in a way or another, and that was going on forever. The steppes peoples were the most threatening ones for the Slavs in general, especially for the eastern ones, as the same Kiev, as we've seen, was growing under, had been growing as the main center under essentially the Khazars, as Moscow, that was literally the most underdeveloped of all, basically the Russian cities, was born exactly at this point. It would essentially develop as the best servant of the Golden Horde. So and indistinguishably so in terms of panoply, for example, we will see that this is already a thing for a reason we explain now, because the Byzantine influence was the most culturally prevalent in arts, in architecture. What we get from the splendid icons of the time, the beautiful Russian art, etc., is heavily, it's Byzantine, right? You can't even basically say this is yet like the Russian version of it's literally the same identical Byzantine art. Also because Byzantine art worked exactly like this. There was a rigid canon that you couldn't be outside of, right? The entire team was sacred, right? There wasn't such a thing like, I don't know, Byzantine lay music, for example, or lay art. Right, it was completely I mean, it existed. Very often it was also foreign influence, but the only true one was the imperial one, was the Roman one, the Christian one. And as a consequence, we see, and we keep seeing throughout all, basically, also Russian history later on, the same replica of this in arts, in iconography, while archaeology tells us something very different, telling the truth. Right, and not that there wasn't a Byzantine influence also in material culture, in panoplies and so on, but as we will see, it's all much more nuanced, and the influence of the steppes, panoplies, military techniques, and so on is very consistent, and we will see how smart at this point the Russian panoply really was, because a Kievan man-at-arm was a hell of a word that had also distinguished itself in part from the Western counterparts. It was also Western influence, admittedly, as we will see now. There were Frankish weapons, stuff like that. But again, they were. It's hard to find something so composite in history of arms and armor. So this is the picture, right? From the late 10th century on, that the commerce between the Varangians and the Byzantines from Scandinavia and north of Eastern Europe to Constantinople, Southern Europe, and the Near East, the Levant, was wholly under the control of the ruler of Kiev. Right? It was known, in fact, as the Khagan of Russia. That is, they literally were intended, basically, as the next sort of steppe overlords, as far as at least the Turkic models that had prevailed up to that point, until the Slavs took over had procured. I mean, in fact, that authoritarian mentality that was at this point actually in the early Rus mitigated by the mercantile, classes mostly, but a bit also the most generalized per capita wealth of more even distribution, right, among the peasantry would be basically destroyed by the Mongols further that import probably in the Far East, especially of the Rus. The same identical Mongolian system, right? The modern Russia is fundamentally a product of that, and specifically of the Muscovites. That the Rusian Palatinate, what we call Ukraine, was essentially Galicia, Volhynia. We've seen in part also those principalities. Those were a completely different thing. It was much more Central European, and in fact, that's what they looked mostly like, right? Also, our distinction of Eastern from Western, from Central European, basically is based, on the Mongol invasions. Fundamentally, that's the characteristic element. Up to the High Middle Ages, there was hardly much of a difference, say, between Poland and the Rus, as such, especially in these areas, in the most developed ones. So there had been an interesting process, right? Say Demic, at least in part, as far as the Varangian elite was concerned, right? The Balkan adventure of Sviatoslav had ended in his own death, right? At some point, he was killed in an ambush, basically. But the Rus had been defeated by the end of the 10th century at the Rostolon. We've seen it in the Byzantine history videos, and as such, the Rus had lost one of its most restless and active element. That is to say, those Rusians, at least, of Scandinavian origin, right? This had maintained for a long time a kind of a more adventuristic profile. Again, as we were saying before, essentially the Rus had always been a Slavic thing, right? And the Scandinavians kept moving from, in some cases, even more primitive areas, at the service of Constantinople, and keeping on that kind of, more daring, war-bending tourism, let's say, and in many directions that went far beyond, right, up to the same Rus, right, in the Caspian Sea, in Anatolia. This had been going for a while. What the Slavs had remained, what they had remained. In the Rus, most of these forces had perished in the fields and gorges of Bulgaria, right? In part, they had been settled by the Byzantines in the same Balkans, that at least by some degree were better than some areas of the Rus and of Scandinavia, of course. But in general, that kind of initial push had, even just as an anthropological model, to end. Because, again, you can't do that in a situation of, like, again, one of the second invasions, right? In a tribal context mostly. When things start to compact, really, this had been the case in the same Scandinavia. That kind of lifestyle had properly ended, right? Monarchies had affirmed. Doesn't matter how much difficulties the peasantry had been regimented and mostly essentially at least excluded from the most updated professional military and more capable, of course, military forces. The system had enlarged and become more rational, more efficient, and more concentrated. Same had been happening, as we were saying, in the Kievan Rus. As a consequence of these sometimes literal massacres of Scandinavians, again, in different battles, in their dispersion, etc., had essentially made the position of the autochthones, that is to say the Slavs and the Finns, stronger. Here we're talking always about the elites, right? We're not talking about the average guy living in some farm in Eastern Europe. Here we're talking about, again, the main princes. We're still as the Rurikid dynasty shows, at least sharing that sense even of the ancestral origins, etc. But it's a dynasty, right? It's not a people, right? It's not a war band. It's not a tribe, right? It's something bigger. In fact, actually, these peoples, as the same term of the Russian Khaganate stresses, owes much to this sense of dynastic power of that had formed in the Turkic steppe, and just in general in the steppes since ever, for which there is basically a very narrow but ultra elite, right, and a floor of subjects. It's not quite the same in the sedentary world. In fact, again, as we were saying before, we see mostly something comparable here with Central Europe, etc., where admittedly the peasantry wasn't living particularly well, right, and that were, say, a sense of public culture actually did not exist, and the condition of the average freeman would degrade, right, in relative terms over time. But again, here is blessed by that dramatic surplus accumulated in the river ports of the Rus. That is also not perhaps the best recipe, admittedly, because it's just like very concentrated wealth, and with very often not even just a particular intent to consolidate just on a major territorial basis for many reasons. First of all, because still Eastern Europe is covered in forests and swamps. It's a hell of a terrain. It's more convenient, definitely, as the Norse had quickly understood, just to take over the same dynastically, to be at least installed as a sort of military elite all across these various centers that are all reachable through ships, also with major expeditions. And the same case is true for the Black Sea, for other areas. And also because the main problem there is that distracts a bit the rulers from that kind of achievement that is definitely stronger, especially again in the south, in what would be known as the Russian Palatinate. Is the fact that they have to cope against steppes enemies, right? And so in that direction, yes, you can make some acquisition here and there on the frontier. The steppe also doesn't begin totally all of a sudden, or at least not everybody who lives in the steppe is a nomadic savage, right? There are settlers. There are many Slavs actually that even before the time of the Cossacks, etc., had probably already been in part assimilated by some Turkic elements, but probably had been joining them, even in more nomadic lifestyle. But there is again this sense that you are the stronger one, for sure, from a sanitary standpoint. But once you chase these guys, and even you push back them into the steppe, maybe you crash some of their chiefdoms, you ravage the areas, etc. Mostly they can retreat, and it feels like you have given a punch in the water, right? You haven't quite crashed the entire thing. Also because there is always an avalanche of other hungry and nothing to lose with kind of Turkic people from the other side, from Central Asia, that can arrive. So this is very frustrating, but it also stimulates that particular military culture that we're going to describe today. In many ways, this time is when this Slavonic and Finnish elites basically become acquainted with the outside world. In many ways, up to that point, they had been essentially either isolated, or again, wherever they would want to step out of the forest, they would find this terrible nomadic warlords ready to harass them. But owing to the activity of their restless Kievan prince, such elites would literally open up to an unprecedented dimension of power and prestige. The eldest unloved son of Sviatoslav, Vladimir, the saint that basically Christianizes and had this more kind of enlightened. He was in his youth even he lived in Scandinavia because he was exiled. He was provided with forces to seize Novgorod, from which he had been kicked out. So still the connection with Scandinavia. Here we're going a bit backwards in time, but there had always been still a broad net of connections here. Had been working hard to strengthen the ties within his kingdom, which stretched from north to south. Right. The importance of being recognized as the overlord, right, independently from any capacity to directly impose oneself across all this enormous space, and with the means of the time, of course. The prestige recognized to Kyiv was just directly proportional to the amount of wealth that was treasured there. Vladimir specifically succeeded in binding together Kiev and Novgorod, and his unifying efforts were crowned, of course, with the evangelization as the unique religion of an otherwise even multinational, we can say, dominion. Right, we've seen how many different, say, ethnic groups, independent from the fact that we're mostly Slavs or fancy with some pitch of Iranian or Turkic, there really was. Of course, this was Christianization for the Rus was the most important, say, unifying factor. Like in the history of Russia, if you look at that, basically there is hardly anything that pre-existed in terms of basically of any political, military, or social association of any sort, right? So this many of these places, this were again the most civilized, but further east, right, the Slavic expansion had been continuing in areas that, again, Europeans as such had never even been venturing or thinking that it existed in memory. So these were spaces that, even just for the scarce documentation, remain a bit shrouded in mystery, also as far as what the hell was happening in the very frontier. But we know well enough what was happening from the center. From Constantinople to the Rus flowed not only theological teaching and wonders of church art, but also military tracts and fashions, let's say, in accordance with the image of the Byzantine apotheosis of a Christian warrior, right? So this traditional, say, meaning it was that the Byzantine iconography contained was fully understood by the Rus, right? At least it was the universal creed, just expressed in different style, artistically, one that, however, these people had never had up to that point. And as we were saying before, such a canon would become so prevalent to in part impair our capacity to distinguish clearly, right, what is at least through that source only, like a Russian man-at-arms from essentially a classicistic remodeling of in fact, 4th, 5th century Eastern Roman style. Let's put it in this way. So the external impetus from Constantinople was the cherry on top, the measure of of top achievement in the development of the Russian arms and armor. Right, Constantinople at this point had basically one of the most advanced military systems in the world, especially in the 10th, in the 11th century. The Byzantines had topped as far as the sedentary world was concerned, the essentially the heaviest form of cavalrymen, right? Think about the cataphracts, the Nicephorian ones. They also made some video on it that we'll come back on at some point, that were really the ultra heaviest thing ever to be seen everywhere in the Mediterranean, in Europe, right? Nobody really had that stuff. We're talking about 3 layers of metal armor, on one over the other, like something so heavy it was literally conceived just because the Byzantine Empire at that point could afford. By the way, this was a relatively contained core, but it was shockingly costly, right? And the objective of it doctrinally is to field such a heavy cavalry that nobody else could properly take on in open field. Naturally, it could work only with an equally massive amount of troops paving their way and revolving around them, around the cataphracts. And that model actually was not adopted by any other people, but the type of technical advancement had been triggered in order to satisfy the doctrinal request, had important repercussions, especially on the areas that were directly influenced by the Byzantine cultures that we're looking at, Eastern Europe in general, right? The Balkans, Anatolia, as long as at least the Byzantines held it. So this was some of the finest, again, military gear that you could find anywhere in the world. The Russians declined this in their own way, which is a mix between this innovation and their own tradition, the type of enemies their own doctrinal demand. In fact, during the centuries we're looking at now, say the 12th, it had evolved as a result of internal changes. So the weaponry of a Russian man-at-arms was, by this point, usually mounted, right? This we'll explain it now if you want, but it's kind of obvious. Included a sword. Of which type, according to you? Actually, a Frankish type. At least, there could be different varieties, of course, namely that this was just an example. We're trying to depict like a stereotype, but we do have this. We do have an impressive influence, of course, of what was also one of the single most advanced military cultures of the Western one, that by the 12th century had basically surpassed, with the Frankish Crusaders, the Italian Marines, all this stuff, at all levels. In fact, on land, at sea, in polycetics, in everything, like had surpassed both the Byzantines and the Muslims as well. So these blades are, as you know, that this time start being massive. By the 13th century, will be evolving towards the very end, at least of it, toward double-handed swords. At this point, you start finding impressive 1.5 ones, and some Russian men-at-arms are massively built enough to know how to handle these beasts. And of course, with a dramatically crashing, chopping, ever-destroying, killing machine kind of mentality that, of course, doesn't find any trace of exception behaviorally. And the only thing being, you find is that this Frankish kind of Western types of swords. I even uploaded here some image of them unequivocally. Frankish in origin, of design at least, but decorated in a local Byzantine one, right? So the Christian style of the Rus at that point. Again, on the mounted dimension here, there is not much to understand. Of course, the Russian elite ruled from this magnificent fortified centers overlooking the great waterways of Eastern Europe, but they were able to do so because they had estates all around, right? So they were mostly, again, a hyper elite. They could afford to train their entire existence, having enough, peasants providing with the adequate calories for especially, it's not much about arms and armor, but again, this constant training, right? Literally the maintenance of the horses, that, as you know, are extremely consuming animals. Something, if you look at what a horse eats and drink every day, it's something unbelievable. And these war steeds naturally were the ones literally smashing people all throughout the battlefield. If there was somebody so foolish to meet with this heavy cavalry without basically any other intermediary or let's say or help, let's put it in that way. And of course, the steppes influence characterizes generally the outlook of the Rusian, this kind of Eastern style of armor. You can't say, but wait a minute, is this like a Khazar? Is it Turkic? Is it? Yeah, it was basically very, very similar, as we will see in part. Is it Byzantine? You don't even understand. We've made videos about arms and armor in depth, and we've seen how everything was naturally very blended. And as I always say, don't let yourself being fooled by some sort of materialistic Gnosticism from those channels that tell you, oh my god, this millimeter away from more left or right made all the difference in this armor. Armor is just armor, right? It's basically identical everywhere. Doesn't matter where it's lamellar, it's coat of mail. It's basically it just does the same thing. It's not what actually changes a big deal on the battlefield, right? What actually does, because it's just even simply a matter of numbers, right? It's not that the same. You can find just even the same numbers or the same quality or same thing by saying make it be, I don't know, lamellar is different from scale or all this various stuff. Everything has a context. This armor, of course, is part of a panoply. It's much more complex. So it's mostly about how these peoples would customize their own, still individually heavily armored type of equipment that was the same. Just for arms and armor, they do pretty much the same identical thing, right? So what we look at here is just that flavor that makes the thing more like what we see archaeologically, iconographically, and so on. For example, the presence of a Slavonic battle axe, right? Which, there is some Norse influence there. There is some kind of local kind of anti-cavalry, especially in a kind of forested context, but something more double-handed that still, aside from the open grounds of the steppes, can be very, very useful in a place like the Rus. We've seen basically was the same reason why you saw kind of more use apparently in places like Scandinavia or Germany. There is no particular reason. There is not the size of people. It's not. No, it depends mostly on especially this dichotomy, how mounted or dismounted you can fight. Right. Again, there is just a degree of that in the option of being able to use such weapons in, say, in a context where cavalry has literally to dismount at a point to fight. This is very common still in 12th century Europe. You do find this in different circumstances. Also because cavalry is surely the prevalent arm, but it's especially in the kind of the Central European context, it's not, and as elsewhere, telling the truth, it's not really decisive and challenging by that. Just from the second half of the 12th century until the early 14th that you find that. So this battle axes could serve as well at, again, opening somebody's rib cage in spite of armor in between, which is hard to claim in a sense, but at least the level of damage just by blunt force right on the guy's chest would be able to break him from the inside. And these massive weapons, however, were conceptually designed to destroy armor by destroying themselves in the process. So whoever had the force of achieving that, which must be really enormous, can really cause dramatic damage to armor as well. The same goes for, I don't know, chopping the head of a horse, right? Like you see even on the Bayeux tapestry, that you could do similar things like opening those poor animals' skulls open like a cucumber with a Danish axe. When they were stopped, of course, because there is no other weapon to stop cavalry but a pike, from prehistory to firearms. So all the rest doesn't work, in case you didn't notice. Yes, and not even for the longbow find. No, it doesn't work like that. Missile infantry is missile infantry, meaning it's light infantry, which by definition doesn't defeat cavalry as such. It's always about combined arm tactics, and by far the heavies are more important than any missile element, but by scale, right? So let's cut away this BS for the cringy way it still persists for some reason in military, in education. Let's go in that way. This man at arms would have, of course, like a spear of either European but also steppe type, which, as we've seen, especially in the latter case, is particularly designed to break through armor in a very effective way, with particularly elaborated types of hands that are importantly at least designed to cause damage properly to the structure of the metal at some point, and or there were different types, of course, but they were designed for that precise reason. A flail of steppe origin, as we've seen among the Turkic peoples since the early Middle Ages, right, to smash more kind of, wildly against armor, causing significant damage at some point. And for this specific function, the Kyivan mace, which was, I created, it's basically it's as if it was a massive sledgehammer, right? We can't. It's actually it's like the section is it's either circular or made with this cut spikes, let's say, but it's what I mean is symmetric. And of course, like maces are normally, and it's just like a massive pole with this very heavy hand. It's meant literally like the best way if you can imagine a mace smash through whatever you can think. Even in that case, again, that tells there is a lot of armor around. That tells that, of course, these elites are ultra heavy ones, and they fight against one another, and they need to deliver those blows, right, to kill the person inside the armor, because it was evidently that important. Of course, maces are used, they're so short, and you can employ them sensibly only if you are armored enough to get that close to the enemy and think it not to be damaged by any other particular kind of blunt, I would say, kind of traumatic capacity, especially penetrating one, rather something that can cause to break you from the inside and bleed out from the inside. The Russian men-at-arms wore a helmet of a form borrowed from the southeast through the steppes, interestingly enough. A sort of kind of conical one, practically, and with significant neck with a camel neck protection, part covering even the faces. We've seen the Norse even had at least the around the eyes protecting the cheekbones, and so that admittedly was to parry significant blows. We've seen the double-handed axes were pretty much out there in the in melee, and these blows arriving with swords and axes from the above, where slash quite violently with a berry center, of course, dramatically shifted towards the top, was evidently quite of a relevant need. Here we are in similar places. As we will see also in other episodes, just like for in this case mostly for the sake of mounted combat, the fact that a bit like in the West at this point, that the helmet is enclosing to properly cover the face, etc. The idea is that you do not want while charging at 45 kilometers per hour against a guy that is arriving at the same speed in front of you, like something hitting your face, right? Which I think is a pretty sensible concern in those circumstances. Now, everything, as I was saying before, adds up to the cost, to the weight, but also, and especially for the heavies, that's what you invest on in a combined arm tactics with other troops. So that's the reason why we talk in this series about the heaviest armor, because it's the most developed one in the first place. But consider here a lot of stuff arrives against you, right? Javelins, arrows. As we'll see, there is quite a liking that the Kievan men-at-arms has towards for bows as well. Differently, at least to a different degree than the Western counterpart. Then you would have this, in the heaviest cases, this multi-layered metal armor that, as we've seen, was a thing at this point. Also in the West, for that matter, there were different types of including lamellar armor used different layers, let's say coat of mail underneath and lamellar on it. We find them, right, especially in places like Germany or Italy, that after all are just pretty close to the East in a sense themselves, and require perhaps a bit also this extra defense from more missile type of enemies, right, visiting, in fact, or being visited, like especially in the north by steppes peoples, in the south, fighting against the Muslims and so on. And at this point, they're the same people because they go out crusades and they visit the same ports in the Black Sea and so on. So it's all that's how they came together, basically, as to this type of say Eastern style of protection. So let's say a Maya halberd, right, and a scale or a lamellar armor of Byzantine type, right. As far as the shield was concerned, it was usually the large drop-shaped one that had evolved, we think, in parallel in the West as in Constantinople from the 10th century. It's quite iconic, and that in Eastern Europe was, however, still paired more frequently still with a round one. Why? Well, because it was popular in the steppes, and generally speaking, we think that infantries, at least as far as the hand-to-hand combat capacity, were not so insidious like the more courageous, compact, and kind of technologically advanced pikes, crossbows, heavy armor, etc. than in the West. So the idea is that in the steppes you consider that relatively less, even though there is a concern for blows coming from below, because again, the steppes is not just about cavalry. The imbricated lamella, for example, that are all say opening upwards, that would suggest that in part. But there is another factor that is the round shield is generally smaller, right? And given that you're so heavily armored, you tendentially need less of a shield, and you know that the shield is going to go smaller over time, exactly because just plate armor will come around from the next century. And actually, these peoples here in the East were exposed to something, at least to designs that would, let's say, acquaint them earlier with plate armor than the Westerners. We see some Hungarians have it witnessed by the Byzantines in the 12th century, at least as chanfron, chess pieces for the horses. So it's likely that there is some of that also in the steppes, right? I will not digress on this, but I will talk about it more completely when talking about Polish warfare. There were admittedly some designs that there are the same ones that will be eventually metally armored, in the West. Like it's an organic base that is enveloping your abdomen, closed in the back, and then you have all the lamellae placed on it, right? So there are lots of them, like without plate armor around, especially in some the so-called traditionally called, at least, Polish belt, right? And the idea is that all these people from the West, the Cumans, the Pagri, we'll talk about them now, had, given their insidious enveloping maneuvers and attacks from the flanks, ambushes, and so on, obliged this kind of more all-around kind of protection that naturally obliges you to be heavier, even as a knight. So there may be something here about the Rusian panoply that is still, however, in all this decorated after the Byzantine fashion. So you see here Frankish, the Byzantine, Turkic, all the stuff blended together, and originally, with an original result. In the 12th century, some minor elements, by the way, including greaves of forged plates, were added to this set of arms, further awakening it. Armaments were gradually becoming more standard, by the way, and easier to manufacture because the Rus was ever more hierarchical in nature, more statal by a degree. They could at least access much more easily armor production from the local craftsmen, the magazines. They had quite quick supply system, and they were quite trade oriented, so they could get, as we've just seen, the finest arms and armor from the surrounding peoples if they had enough money. They had at this point. But was properly, and we think at least, an increase in production, right? That is to say, what happens a bit like in the West too, that the communal infantries are getting heavier, richer, and more aggressive in this sense. So here too, right, we don't see a dramatically advanced Eastern European infantry at this point. More or less those areas would not have the same level of cohesion, just even for the way they're scattered across the territory and demographic density and more. In general, per capita wealth, these are some of the poorest areas in Europe in that sense. In fact, also the basis of this nobility were somehow fragile. The fact that they got heavier doesn't actually mean that everybody was getting particularly rich. Also, the merchants have their own oligarchies, but they can indeed relatively easily and cheaply equip large amounts of troops. I made a video about the Rusian militiamen, by the way. I think it's between the 13th and 14th century, so not exactly this time, but still, right? At that point, there would be some kind of even more specialized type of troops, more mercenaries. The militias would gradually decline, wear themselves out, and so that before the Mongol invasion, by the way, and we think that the social imbalance, in fact, had a lot to do with why eventually the Rus was taken over, was in crisis even before the Mongols struck. So the Russian set of weapons was, as you understand, akin to that of the European men-at-arms at the end, in the core essentials, right? There's not much of a difference. Yet, what we see is that Russian armor was more solid, right, and heavy, owing to scaled and lamellar armors which either supplanted or even supplemented mail armor, right? In the West, again, it's all basically coat of mail, best double layer. That's it, right? Maybe just some plate again, as far as the helmet was concerned, but that's basically it. Here, you realize that the elites are significantly more. At least they get more wealth, not necessarily from an individual point of view, but those who can, right? Push it more far than what the Westerners really do. And part of the reason is, again, not much of a positive one, because in the West, the great monarchs, princes, etc., could rely on substantial, also strong infantry and a sort of closer, more politically compact coordination, right? The Rus was still a bit wilder, right? The idea that the prince was the champion/hero of the situation would have a more warrioristic, individualistic mentality. So take it all, right? It's all for me. And as we've seen, aside from these merchants, there is not really like a middle class like in Western Europe that can compare. And also, again, put the knights under strain, but in that sense, not responding with warriorism, but actually responding with collective training, with something more advanced in terms of a broader art of war. That's not to say that the Russians were backwards in that too. Actually, they had quite impressive tactical system, but say the social variation of their extraction wasn't that comparable to the one in the West, and this explains, right, why the predominant armor of Western Europe was, generally speaking, lighter. And this kind of factotum type of, in fact, man-at-arm is showed in from the Russian side with the fact that normally he was also an archer, right? At least not, as we've seen, as a primary, role, right? But still a bit like in the steppes, it was the normality. So the influence there on the senators was still remarkable, and obliged, just because again they had to always counter this massive hails of arrows coming from the steppes peoples that again were not stronger than them, but were quite annoying. And so there you have a bit more of Eastern appreciation of the bow, while in the West it's more like, a lesser weapon. And even though, of course, all Western aristocrats know how to use a bow as any type of arm perfectly, they do it just mostly during the hunt, right? And they fight in a substantially different way, even though as a side weapon, surely there was, right? And together with crossbows, etc. Consider that here we're talking about a military culture that is influenced by the composite bow of the steppe on a regular basis, which is something more advanced even just for mounted combat, right? In the West, where there is more infantry around and heavier and so on, what are you going to do, like with a guy that basically still can't switch from that weapon to another, right? You have the self bow, simple one, like you can't, in theory you can use a long bow on horseback, right? But at least there were mounted archers, mounted crossbowmen, but they function in a separate way. It's a bit more of a civilized way to operate, right? At least in an environment that is developing also actually a more robust statal profile than these areas that were just essentially, it doesn't matter how powerful, but still a cluster of principalities. You can argue, well, the West was the same. Yeah, it was the same, but statally speaking, logistically speaking, let's say in a broader, also strategic sense, they were, just think about that, operating on a much more densely populated, urbanized, fortified system. I mean, it was a completely different thing. They were more orderly, right? It's interesting to make these comparisons. You have to understand these panoplistic differences on the base of those political, military, and social issues that on a bigger scale, not just again the small brain kind of single guy, single fighter kind of thing, that around which 95% of I think the YouTube interest in medieval warfare revolves around, because playing too much RPG games and not reading any book in your entire life unfortunately does have that influence on your brain. In any case, for these reasons, on the whole, the Russian set of arms was more akin to that of the noblemen of the Balkans, of the Levant, even of Central Asia or Iran, than the West. Right? It's again mostly a matter of style, if we're looking just at the panoply per se, but still the Eastern influence is heavy, right? And you want to appreciate that. Now, passing to the Cumans, right? This people emerged as a new rival of the Rus in the 11th, 12th century. They were Turkic steppe peoples. We will see that they were relative to the Pechenegs. We will look at the differences also in the various episodes, but they were fundamentally similar, and they were actually quite large, right? They failed, however, to form a real khaganate, right? So they managed at least to establish several chiefdoms, we can say, and harassing the Rus consistently. So they settled mostly in the south, right, in the steppes, more or less the ones occupied by the Russians during the war today, right? So the places that were kind of the wildest, the least populated, and probably had always remained somehow inhabited by nomads, like just with this northern giant that could control this or that waterway, coastal center, etc. Because that's how the Rus had maintained part of their power, right? They didn't care to occupy that large area, because again, it's just the steppes. It's very costly. Nobody really even wants to. How do you do that, right? Do you send colonies there? Do you upgrade? Do you start building cathedrals in the desert, right? The most important thing is controlling the trade legitimately. So you send garrisons mostly in the most civilized places, the great towns, along the riverways, along the coast, in Crimea, on the Don, in the various places that just by being held are going to generate a significant amount of income. And then you basically protect the caravans, you escort them, you provide with some broader security, and the peoples that inhabit the steppes, by the way, in between that and Kyiv, are, again, generally speaking, obedient, right? The Cumans arrive, again, as this yet another step of Turkish people. They're a bit, Turkic people, if you prefer, they're a bit spent, right? They, for this reason, they're not so cohesive as to, as we've seen, the Turkic steppe had really put out a lot of people, right? So at this point, the steppes were to become not necessarily obsolete, right? But this is not anymore the time of the great steppe conquerors. Even the Mongols will succeed essentially in their capacities, because they would take control of civilized areas, and Mongolia will remain essentially the one it was before. We've seen already with the Khazars that they were a great power because they had starting to give themselves a sort of more permanent statal territorial profile. Also, the Volga Bulgars were quite, sedentary in many ways. We've made a bit about that. And so here you have mostly the steppes corridor that is open up to Central Europe, because the Cumans pour in, as you know, up to Hungary, Germany, places like these, forming important mercenaries. They were just basically a bunch of locusts eating everything along their path, but just again paving the way to the major armies and being in for the loot, so you wouldn't have even just to pay them. They were quite wild. Naturally, they were pagan, as we will see. That while meeting with the Rus, some things would change in their culture and lifestyle, admittedly. And they fight also in very primitive ways, but again, it's mostly their moral drive, what they can pillage, loot from these areas, and also partly settle in with the same consent of the Rus at some point that will that will take place. Naturally, the Kyivans were not sitting ducks. They started launching punitive campaigns that were at times also quite successful, right? And an unstable equilibrium was established. Here I'm making it very simple, because there was all the policy with Constantinople in between. It's a very complicated thing. These peoples are hired en masse in the Byzantine army. They're a bit of a pain in the behind for everyone involved. but they're also constituting this easy source of cheap throwaway kind of light cavalry, the steppes type that is becoming ever more strategically and doctrinally employed as far as this great 12th century empires are necessitating large kind of buffer zones, frontier areas. Think about the Danubian one in the Balkans between Hungary and Constantinople, etc. So it's in part, they are annoying, but they're also useful to a degree if properly addressed, right? And again, here it's Kyiv that establishes that has the upper hand and basically determines the spaces. After all what had been important up to that point with any other steppe people was to cooperate, right? The Khazars were an important target that the Rusians managed to strike, admittedly also at a very in very faraway areas. The supply lines there of the Rus were quite stretched, and it shows how advanced the military machine really was. Because of the aforementioned reason, like the Khazars had actual towns, right? And they could be targeted in those places, as we've seen. The Caliphate back in the day had obliged them to move from certain parts of Ciscaucasia. They had to shift their capital further north. That's also where essentially the other peoples will settle in their setting. And again, they're gradually becoming more sedentary, right? The princes, the elites, etc., live in towns. They're not just living out there in the steppes. It's again, the influence of sedentary civilization there is becoming stronger and stronger. It will not cease in that regard. Yes, there will be some times of contraction. Arguably, there is not a radical change all of the sudden of how the steppe peoples lived in the area. But still, the world ages, and also what we call modernity advances. So, in a couple of 100 years from then, even a bit, the steppes tactics will become, as you know, obsolete, right? By the 16th century, at least, pike and shot tactics are an unsurpassable obstacle for the nomadic steppe, right? We will arrive to that point with the Cedars, hopefully. So the Cuman Khans became in-laws of the Rusian princes. That's yet another dynamic that is quite evident even just in Eastern Europe in general, at many levels. They became involved in intestine wars in the Rus. Of course, some of them would follow this or that prince, and they were settled in part so that they could, especially on the frontier, they could constitute a bulwark against peoples that fundamentally lived like them. So they began to live among the Slavs, and I made different videos about this. Some of these Turkic, later Mongol elements will be settled as far as Poland, Central Europe. Again, the Cumans at this very point, in Slovakia, for example, left an important trace. In Hungary, right, there were some Angevin kings that had been marrying Cuman princesses, and we're talking about some European royalties here in Hungary, Naples, places like this. So the impact of these populations will be great, and they will not stop coming, by the way, because eventually with the Mongols the situation will be a bit even worse, right? A bit like with the migration era when the Huns arrived from the east, except this time the West was bulkier to even withstand, of course, that impact and absorb even this Cumans without them becoming a threat. You understand here they're kind of less cohesive, less threatening, less that they are hitting on a kind of a harder world that is one another able to absorb them. So as we were saying before, the Cuman fighting style was pretty basic. They were invariably mounted archers, right? They were fully nomads. The noblemen were equipped with sabers and spears, but again, in the typical Turkic fashion, and especially at this time, as those wars had been so spent, there is just like a relatively tiny elite, and that all the others are the product of some conquest, subjugation, and they don't really have much, right, except their mounts and hoping to get the better pasture throughout all this trouble, right? Their life is brutally as traumatically short. They live like, they eat anything, that they live in terrifying climatic conditions. They know how to survive there in the wild, to do things that, of course, you would never be able to do, right? Even if you tried for a lifetime, because they were bred like that from birth. The elites at least used mail as armor, as we've seen this had spread from quite some time in the Turkic world, since, say, migration era time, as even at some point more widespread than lamellar, and they rarely also used round shields and helmets. Again, they were not really great shock fighters. There were some of them who were naturally pretty heavy, and they mirror a bit the military advancement of kind of the other populations. But generally speaking, their entire fighting style was hit-and-run tactics, and mostly also sheltering the elite element as much as possible, and being very, very economical about that, right? Not trying to wipe out each other, right? Because in the steppes that happens with much greater frequency than in the sedentary world, where you more or less come to rule over someone rather than wiping them out if you manage to take over. This, and especially helmets were richly decorated, at least. That was their the better status kind of show off, right? It was exclusive to the nobility in practice, for whatever being noble means in a Cuman world, where you understand that there is that elite ruling, but in a way there are also relatively less societal norms, or at least there are speedier ways to rise and fall, right, in some way. And you find that they're very popular everywhere. They become like like in video games, the average cheap type of light cavalry can keep throwing at the enemy, and that doesn't cost you too much, right? And it's literally like, unlike many other things, that's actually accurate, right? Because these people are desperate, by the way, to some degree. They inhabit the worst places. They are habituated to survive with very few. So if you, again, must nurture your own ultra-heavy cavalry, like as we've seen the Kyivan or the Byzantine one, it's it's a massive asset. You must have all the infrastructure, the social background as well, the statal apparatus. These guys are just there, and that's why they had always been so present. Again, before the Cumans were others, I made a video specifically about the 6th century. I know that was the heavier, actually, cavalry type, but I mean equally, like these people's, like, you couldn't even distinguish them. What's the difference between the Cumans and the Pechenegs in the type they fight? It's not really a sensible question to be asked. They're basically the same. It had always been basically whatever you could find around those places. There is a specific group, at least, of Cumans that will become more famous because they would adapt more to the sedentary life. That is the Karakalpak, which literally means black hoods, black hats. You've probably heard them. The Rus, I think they call them Svoi Pagania, which means something like our own pagans, right? That would settle in again in Eastern Europe, as we've seen, in part even Central Europe, and that means that those are the Turks that we know better. Like when the Mongols arrived, those were not our pagans, It's like saying, these are our bitches, basically, because we defeated them, we deported them, we settled them, like military colonies for our rulers to just form some forces to oppose to the one of the nobility. That's the same reason. Again, if you look at the video made on the Lipka Tatars for Poland, you understand what was the mechanism there, also from a military point of view, why Sarmatism was so strong, ideally, where it was all about this sense of the foreigner, like being distrusted. But again, we don't have time to digress, but because it did correspond to a more centralizing policy, and these guys were easily settled, at least to the degree that by doing so they would be protected just by the leader of the place, right? Meaning, as we've seen, like, I don't know, caliphs having, outside, think about the Mamluks, or I don't know, Frederick II having the Saracen bodyguard, thing like that, because these people in the normal society of the places would have been dead, right? They could live there in better conditions, the better land, the sanitary world, still in peripheral marginal areas, but much better than the living hell that the steppe constitutes, because the king allowed them. So they would be fanatically loyal, as it was mostly the case. I mean, they could make their own mess every once in a while, but right, they were sometimes more reliable than the ethnic locals. So, in other words, the Black Hats were Turkic tribes serving the Kievan Rus, and at some point constituting even the numerical bulk of its cavalry. They were, again, basically akin to the Cumans, right? They were called Caracal Pact because, again, literally the Black Hats was the Black Hoods was their name, right? That's how in the steppes you also can call yourself ethnically, because that's your custom, your way, you're in this blender to distinguish yourself in a way from any other way, and that's basically it. Like, that's how we cannot interview a 12th century Caracal Pack, living in the Kievan Rus. So we should have asked them to see how they felt about their own identity or whatever. But you get the idea, right? The most important thing for them was to be there in the first place and having achieved what they did. And again, they were in part living their own traditional life, still in some areas, but still sedentarizing in the meanwhile. So they would gradually be absorbed by the local population, like many other had done before, and they would do in the future, especially the Mongols, etc. So that's again something we will see hopefully in the next episodes. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.